My parents dragged me along to the square even though I had repeatedly told them that there was no point in me going. They kept telling me that it was a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I kept pointing out to them that I was completely deaf, so wouldn't be able to hear anything, but my mother promised she would translate everything for me. I stood in the stifling heat and kept getting shoved about by people as they tried to get closer to the stage. My father offered to place me on his shoulders, but I declined as I was almost a teenager now. There was a change in the atmosphere in the crowd, and I glanced up onto the stage to see a bunch of high-ranking clergy on stage. As they began speaking, I glanced over to my mother, but she was too entranced with what they were saying to translate. I glanced over my shoulder. I could see dozens of TV crews who were broadcasting this across the globe to an expected audience of over 1 billion. There was a blinding light from the front of the stage, and I spun around to see the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. The clergymen looked confused for a second, but quickly composed themselves and stepped aside. The woman walked up to the microphone and glanced around at the hushed crowd that was awaiting her first words. I felt her eyes linger on me for a second, and felt a weird sense of dread for some reason. She finally opened her mouth and began to speak. It was at this moment that I felt a splatter of rain fall on my face and quickly wiped it off with my sleeve. A wave of confusion crossed my face as my sleeve was now all red. I looked up at my mom and was horrified to see that blood was pouring down from her nose and eyes, but she just had this weird look of contentment across her face. My father slowly slid to his knees with blood pouring out of all his orifices. I turned around to ask for help, but was met by a sea of blood-smeared smiling faces. I stood there in shock as one by one they slowly collapsed to the floor. I felt a tap on my shoulder, and slowly I turned around. The woman stood there with a pleasant smile on her face and gave me a hug before turning around and disappearing. I stood in the square, surrounded by smiling corpses, and finally understood why God never tried to communicate with us.